Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Happy Thursday, everybody. We begin once again with the stock market and fiscal signals. I know we have been covering this every day, but this is the big news from this week in China, and every day hundreds of billions of dollars in capital is moving around in response to this developing situation. The Chinese stock market roller coaster continues as investors and analysts wait for signals that Beijing is serious about stimulus. As we remember, on Tuesday and Wednesday, markets were deeply dissatisfied when the National Development and Reform Commission announced only 200 billion yuan in extra stimulus, rather than the 3 to 4 trillion many had hoped for. Indeed, as Chinese financial media outlet WWIII writes today, quote, "Currently the market still expects incremental fiscal policies and specific plans, with estimates of incremental policies ranging from 2 to 3 trillion yuan to over 10 trillion yuan. End quote. The CSI 300 plunged 7% yesterday. Today, it was announced that this Saturday, the State Council Information Office will hold a press conference with the Minister of Finance, who will announce the relevant situation regarding, quote, strengthening the counter-cyclical adjustment of fiscal policy and promoting high-quality economic development. End quote. This has also raised hopes that more stimulus is coming. The timing of the event is curious, though, as veteran China analyst Bill Bishop expressed today, quote, holding it on a Saturday when the markets is closed is an interesting move. Perhaps the State Council and the Minister of Finance are worried about a National Development Reform Commission-like stinker of a press conference that disappoints, and so do not want to have to take the responsibility for crashing the market while it is open. Or perhaps senior officials have realized that holding these press conferences that are the focus of so much expectation while the markets are open is a bad idea. So everyone is left waiting to see if there really will be any significant additional stimulus. Perhaps the Saturday Minister of Finance press conference will discuss something new and large. But even if they do, we will probably not have all the details until the NPC Standing Committee meeting later this month. The State Council's communication approach to the markets may need to be modernized too. End quote. But some analysts remain very optimistic. Banks including Morgan Stanley and HSBC Holdings expect 2 trillion yuan, $283 billion in stimulus, while Citigroup Inc. put the amount at 3 trillion yuan. Economists have speculated measures such as support for local government financing, infrastructure investment, and a consumption boost and bank recapitalization. And it's not just international commentators saying this either. Bai Chongen, Dean of Tsinghua University's School of Economics and Management, estimated that local governments accumulated an additional 6.8 trillion yuan, almost $1 trillion of deficit during the pandemic, of which around 3 trillion yuan was covered using fiscal transfers from the central government or their own special-purpose bond proceeds. He suggests in a piece this week that Beijing should help local authorities address the rest of this deficit, as many businesses are still awaiting payment from local governments. A senior fiscal expert told Caixin that the central government should issue 8 trillion yuan, $1.13 trillion in additional treasury bonds this year, and use around half to help local governments fill the holes in their books left by COVID-related spending. Meanwhile, regulators are deeply concerned about a stock market frenzy getting out of hand. Financial News, a publication backed by China's central bank, reported Wednesday that financial regulators had issued guidance to commercial banks urging them to strictly monitor the use of credit funds and prevent the illegal flow of loans into the stock market. Consumer loans, typically used for housing renovations, education, and durable goods, have been increasingly misappropriated for stock trading during market booms, the piece writes. Quote, with some banks offering them at interest rates below 3%, lower than the cost of financing through brokerages. Regulators are on alert for loan fund misuse that could fuel risky speculation. End quote. Many inexperienced retail investors appear to be jumping into the highly volatile market too. As the US-based New York Times writes in a piece published yesterday called Young Chinese Investors Are Jumping into the Stock Market Frenzy, quote, many young people have turned to online stock trading platforms like Futu and Snowball, where they can get started within a day or two. On Tiger Brokers, which gives investors access to Chinese stocks that are listed in Hong Kong, the number of users under 31 increased 77% in the days after the government's announcements versus the week before. End quote. So, all eyes are on Beijing for fiscal support signals. Feng Chucheng, founding partner of Hutong Research, said China's legislature, the National People's Congress, would need to approve the kind of big new government bond issuance needed to fund a stimulus package. The Congress's standing committee typically convenes towards the end of October. In a previous instance a year ago, involving funds for disaster relief, the Ministry of Finance announced the amount of spending only after the National People's Congress approved it. Next up, Professor Zheng Yonglian, director of the Advanced Institute of Global and Contemporary China Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, an outspoken commentator and someone seen as a highly influential intellectual in China, a month ago published an essay titled "The Third World War and Its Asian Power Keg." Several China commentators have observed that in recent weeks it appears that the essay has been circulated among top PRC officials, and that it may have even been read and commented on by Xi Jinping himself. Of course, we cannot be sure whether that is accurate or not, as this piece appears to be quite influential in elite circles, resonating with many in the leadership. It is very useful to examine some of it, to get an idea of how the Chinese themselves are discussing this question of a possible world war. Obviously, this is a Chinese perspective within the political correctness of the PRC, so it's framed that way. External actors get most of the criticism, especially the US. We will also see arguments which are vulnerable to much pushback and criticism. But we do not examine this piece because we necessarily agree or disagree with it, but to understand how those within the system at its highest policy-making levels in the PRC are thinking about and conceptualizing these questions about a possible world war. Now, before we jump into the essay, just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribing is also a big help for those who want to keep on top of this analysis as it's released, and it's also a tremendous help for the channel and the algorithm. Thank you so much. Now, this is a long piece, but considering the gravity of the subject matter, it's worth examining at length. We end by quoting selected excerpts in translation from Chinese directly. 1. The shadow of World War returns. As the world order centered around the United Nations since World War II collapses, and geopolitics driven by great power competition becomes increasingly unstable, more and more people are beginning to believe that a third world war may be inevitable. In fact, for many, a new form of Cold War between major powers has already begun, with the next question being, where will the main battlefield of World War III take place? With the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, people are concerned that these regional conflicts might escalate into larger conflicts involving multiple nations. However, most observers do not believe these regions will become the main battlegrounds for the next world war. Indeed, there are growing signs that the major powers are trying to shift the battlefield of a potential World War III to Asia, which is rapidly becoming the powder keg of this looming conflict. 2. Asia as a power keg. From any perspective, the Asia-Pacific region is destined to become the battlefield of the next world war. The reasoning is simple. All the elements that lead to a world war are present here. Economic interests, the US, an Asian NATO, military modernization, and nationalism. The US is becoming the key organizer of an Asian war, driven primarily by the huge economic interests it stands to gain in the region. Moreover, with the US facing severe internal challenges that it cannot resolve through revolution, external war becomes a more plausible solution. Historically, internal revolution and external war have been the two most effective ways to address major national interests, and there is no reason to underestimate the likelihood of the US initiating a war to solve its internal problems. Why Asia? Discussions about Asia's importance to the US and the West abound. American diplomats Robert D. Blackwell and Richard Fontaine, in their recent book, Lost Decade, the US Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power, directly address this issue, pointing to Asia's share of global data and the rise of China. Asia accounts for 60% of the world's population, 3 of the world's top 5 economies, 40% of global GDP, 41% of total global exports, 37% of total imports, half of the world's active military personnel, 6 of the world's top 10 military powers, 5 of the 9 nuclear-armed nations, and 6 of the world's top 10 carbon emitters. More importantly, they argue, is China's continuous threat to the international order. It is worth noting that the US is not a true outsider. Although geographically distant, its deep-seated economic and political interests make it an integral part of Asia. Since the late 20th century, especially after World War II, the US has been heavily involved in Asian affairs, from Japan to the Korean Peninsula, and from East Asia to ASEAN. With Asia becoming the center of global economic gravity, the US has increasingly become an Asia-Pacific nation, not just an Atlantic power. The combination of its imperial ambitions and economic interests in Asia creates a powerful force driving the region towards conflict. In sum, after a lost decade, the US now refocuses on the Asia-Pacific. It has already established multiple mini-alliances in the region aimed at containing China. While the US claims these actions are meant to prevent conflicts, in reality they are laying the groundwork for a larger, potentially global war involving NATO, an Asian version of NATO, and other Asian nations. 3. US strategy in the Asia-Pacific. NATO's strategic shift toward China is a key part of the US's effort to contain China's rise. There are no direct geopolitical conflicts between China and the European countries, as their interactions have primarily focused on trade and economics. However, the US has bundled China and Russia together, waging a cognitive war that frames China as a threat to Europe. Since the Russia-Ukraine war began, the US and Europe initially believed they could quickly bring Russia to its knees, but this has not been the case. As a result, the US has now shifted to focus to China, seeing China's support for Russia as the main factor allowing Russia to continue its war. Numerous US-led European policy research institutions are actively involved in this cognitive warfare, which has quickly led NATO to shift its strategic focus toward China. On July 9, 2024, NATO held a summit in Washington, D.C., where US Congress members from both parties expressed their desire to strengthen cooperation with European allies to address what they called China's aggressive military actions in the Indo-Pacific region. From every perspective, it can be said that this summit was specifically aimed at China. NATO focused on 5 key issues related to China. Why is NATO shifting its strategic focus toward China? What signal does NATO want to send to China? How can NATO play a substantive role in countering the China threat? Will NATO have a direct confrontation with China? And why did NATO invite Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand again? Before the summit, US and Western politicians and media were working hard to demonize China, as usual linking China with Russia. As international observers predicted, NATO's summit issued a statement publicly condemning China for providing military support to Russia for the first time. To bring NATO into Asia or establish an Asian NATO, the US-led NATO has been actively seeking cooperation with Asia-Pacific countries in recent years. In this process, Japan has played a central role as the US's key agent. Although Japan's domestic policies have seen little success, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has been working hard to shape an Asian NATO. 4. Challenges for Asian societies. From the perspective of the geopolitical shift, Asia faces unprecedented dangers of war. Whether in terms of geopolitics, conventional warfare, or nuclear deterrence, the situation in Asia is rapidly deteriorating. Unfortunately, Asian societies are not fully aware of these risks, and more countries are joining this dangerous war game, whether willingly or passively. Additionally, nationalist sentiments are on the rise across the region. Historically, nationalism has often been a significant factor leading to conflicts and wars between nations. In the age of social media, decision-makers are more easily swayed by nationalist sentiments, leading them to make irrational, emotionally driven decisions. China undoubtedly sits at the eye of the storm in this geopolitical drama. In light of these tectonic geopolitical shifts, people may gain a deeper understanding of the so-called unprecedented changes unseen in a century. Naturally, how to respond to such profound geopolitical changes will be the greatest challenge faced by this generation. Here ends the direct quote in today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Thursday, and I will see you all tomorrow.